The year 1941 did not begin with a bang, but with a chilling, calculated silence. In the early morning mist of Washington, D.C., the grand white pillars of the Capitol stood as monuments to a peace that was rapidly disintegrating. To the casual observer walking down Pennsylvania Avenue, the United States was a fortress of isolationism. The Great Depression was a fresh scar, and the American public had no appetite for another European slaughter. But behind the heavy oak doors of the War Department, the atmosphere was far from peaceful. It was Tecanese. A group of men in smoke-filled rooms were looking at maps that the public would unsee for years. They weren't looking at where the wall was. They were looking at where the world would end if they didn't act. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler was at the zenith of his power. The swastika flew from the Atlantic coast of France to the outskirts of Moscow, to the Nazi high command. The United States was a degenerate nation, a land of jazz, cowboys, and divided politics. Hitler believed that by the time the sleeping giant could even lace its boots, the new order would be set in stone. He viewed the Atlantic Ocean not as a bridge, but as a barrier that would keep the Americans trapped in their own hemisphere. But Hitler's greatest mistake was not a tactical one on the battlefield. It was an intelligence failure of catastrophic proportions. He failed to see the shadow over Washington. The shadow was cast by a man named Major Albert Wedemeyer. Under the direction of General George C. Marshall, Wedemeyer was tasked with a project so ambitious it bordered on the impossible: the Victory Plan. This document was not a stirring speech about liberty or a collection of patriotic slogans. It was a cold, brutal, and terrifyingly precise mathematical equation. It was a blueprint for the total mobilization of an entire continent. The task was to calculate exactly how many men, how many tanks, how many tons of coal, and how many gallons of oil it would take to physically dismantle the Third Reich. Wedemeyer and his team worked in the shadows. They had to assume that the British Empire might fall. They had to assume that the Soviet Union might collapse under the weight of Operation Barbarossa. If the world was to be saved, America would have to do it alone, from scratch. They began by auditing the entire American economy. They didn't ask, what can we do? They asked, what is required to destroy the enemy? The answer was staggering. The blueprint called for an army of 10 million men. It called for the creation of armored divisions that did not yet exist, and a naval fleet that would dwarf every other navy on Earth combined. This was the era of the Great Debate. While Charles Lindbergh and the America First Committee spoke to thousands, urging them to stay out of the European mess, the men in the War Department were secretly placing orders for millions of uniforms and billions of rounds of ammunition. The archives reveal a chilling duality. A President Franklin D. Roosevelt who publicly promised, your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign wars, while privately signing off on a plan that assumed total global conflict was inevitable. It was a grand deception, a necessary shadow played out to buy time for the industrial gears to start turning. The logistics were nightmares brought to life. How do you feed 10 million men on 3 different continents? How do you transport a Sherman tank across 3,000 miles of an ocean infested with U-boat wolf packs? The Victory Plan provided the answers in dry, bureaucratic prose. It detailed the conversion of the American automobile industry, the greatest manufacturing engine in human history, into a weapon of war. It envisioned Detroit not as a city of cars, but as an arsenal of democracy. In 1941, this was mere fantasy. The U.S. Army was smaller than that of Portugal. Many soldiers were training with wooden rifles and trucks labeled tank. But the blueprint didn't care about the present. It was obsessed with the future. This first chapter of the HCA Archive Deep Dive explores this tensioned and terrifying gap between American reality and the American blueprint. We look at the secret meetings between Marshall and Roosevelt, the hidden memos that bypassed Congress, and the silent mobilization of the U.S. Navy in the North Atlantic months before the first bomb fell on Pearl Harbor. The blueprint was a confession. America knew the war was coming, and they knew exactly how much blood it would cost. They were preparing to trade millions of lives for the survival of Western civilization. As the sun set over the Potomac in the autumn of 1941, the shadow over Washington grew longer. The plans were drawn. The numbers were crunched. The factories were beginning to hum with a low, rhythmic vibration. The giant wasn't just waking up. It was calculating the exact force needed to crush Hitler's skull. The past is watching, and the archives showed that the war wasn't won in the mud of Normandy or the ruins of Berlin. It was won here, in the cold, quiet offices of Washington, before the world even knew the clock had started ticking. By the summer of 1941, the shadow over Washington had transformed from a vague concept into a concrete, terrifyingly detailed document known as the Victory Plan. To understand the sheer scale of this blueprint, one must look past the battlefield and into the cold, hard logic of the men who wrote it. While the world focused on the tactical brilliance of the German Blitzkrieg, lightning war that had Europe, the American strategists were looking at the war as a problem of industrial plumbing. If Hitler's war machine was a predatory wolf, the American Victory Plan was the design for a cage large enough and strong enough to trap it and starve it into submission. The primary architect of this plan, Albert Wedemeyer, was not your typical armchair general. He had spent years in Germany, studying at the Kriegsakademie in Berlin, where he witnessed the Nazi war machine from the inside. He understood the German psyche, their obsession with speed, and their fatal flaw, a lack of long-term endurance. Wedemeyer knew that Hitler was betting everything on a short war. The American blueprint, therefore, had to be the opposite. It had to be a plan for an agonizingly long, resource-heavy conflict that would eventually exhaust the Reich's finite supplies of rubber, oil, and manpower. The Victory Plan was finalized on September 11, 1941, exactly 3 months before the United States would officially enter the war. It was a massive document that dared to answer a question no one else was asking. What is the maximum military force the United States can generate without collapsing its own economy? The answer was a staggering mobilization of 10 million men, but the blueprint went deeper. It broke down exactly how many of those men would be in the infantry, how many would fly bombers, and how many would be needed to run the supply lines that stretched across the oceans. At the heart of the plan was a controversial doctrine known as Europe First. Despite the rising tensions with Japan and the Pacific, the blueprint was adamant. Germany was the primary threat. Hitler's industrial and scientific base in Europe was too dangerous to ignore. The strategists calculated that if they spent their resources fighting Japan first, Hitler would consolidate his grip on the Soviet Union in the Middle East, becoming invincible. Therefore, the blueprint mandated that the Pacific would be a defensive theater, a hold-in action, while the hammer of American might was forged to strike Berlin. The archives revealed the brutal coldness of these calculations. Wedemeyer's team calculated the tonnage required for victory. They didn't just plan for tanks. They planned for the cranes required to lift the tanks, the docks required to receive them, and the thousands of miles of railway tracks that would have to be laid in foreign lands to move them. They realized that to win, America didn't just need a bigger army than Germany. It needed a bigger civilization. The Victory Plan envisioned the United States as a giant factory state, where every civilian was a gear in a global machine. One of the most chilling aspects of the blueprint was its assessment of the Soviet Union. In 1941, most Western observers believed the Red Army would be destroyed within weeks. The American strategists, however, factored the Soviet survival into their blueprint. They realized that if the Soviets fell, the American Victory Plan would have to be doubled in size, requiring 20 million men and decades of war. This realization led to the secret Lend-Lease programs. Before America was even at war, the blueprint was directing the flow of thousands of trucks, planes, and millions of boots to the Eastern Front. America was essentially paying for the Red Army to stay in the fight with industrial blood, buying time for the U.S. to build its own forces. The blueprint also addressed the Atlantic Gap, the mid-ocean area where German U-boats operated beyond the reach of Allied planes. The plan called for the construction of an unsinkable aircraft carrier, the island of Great Britain. The logistical section of the Victory Plan detailed the transformation of the United Kingdom into a massive warehouse. Millions of tons of supplies would have to be ferried across the Atlantic, hidden from Nazi eyes, and stockpiled for a future invasion that was still years away. The archives show that the planners were already designing the artificial Mulberry harbors and the underwater pipelines Pluto to carry fuel across the English Channel in 1941. They were solving the problems of 1944 before the war had even begun. However, the Victory Plan faced a massive internal threat. Political exposure. In early December 1941, the Chicago Tribune leaked the details of the plan to the public. The headline screamed that Roosevelt was planning an army of 10 million for a foreign war. The isolationist movement was outraged. It seemed as though the blueprint would be torn up before it could be implemented. But just 3 days later, the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor. The debate ended instantly. The secret plan was no longer a political liability. It was the only map to survival. As part 2 of this archive, Deep Dive concludes, we see the transition from paper to reality. The blueprint was no longer just ink and theory in a Washington office. It was now a command. The orders were sent to Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Oakland. The gears began to turn. The victory plan had predicted that it would take until 1944 to fully mobilize the required force. The blueprint demanded patience, a terrifying prospect as Hitler's armies were at the gates of Moscow and Cairo. But the Americans trusted their math. They knew that once the industrial Leviathan was fully awake, no force on Earth, not even the combined might of the Axis, could stop the tide. The past is watching, and the HCA archive reminds us that victory was not a miracle of morale or a stroke of luck. It was a premeditated industrial execution. The blueprint was set. Now, the factory fires were about to roar. As 1942 dawned, the secret blueprints in Washington were no longer just theoretical exercises. They had become the operating instructions for the largest industrial explosion in human history. To understand why the Axis powers ultimately failed, one must look away from the tanks in the African desert and the snipers in the ruins of Stalingrad. Instead, the gaze must shift to the soot-stained skies of the American Midwest. This was the awakening of a force so massive that it rendered traditional military strategy obsolete. If the German war machine was a rapier-sharp, precise, and deadly, the American response was a tidal wave of molten steel that could not be. The archives reveal a startling reality. Hitler's economic advisors had warned him about the United States' industrial potential as early as 1937. However, the Nazi leadership was blinded by their own ideological arrogance. They believed that a democracy was too soft, too fractured, and too obsessed with consumer comforts to ever achieve the discipline required for a total war. They saw Detroit as a city of luxury cars and Hollywood as a factory for dreams. They did not realize that the same assembly lines that built the American middle class could, within months, be recalibrated to build the instruments of global annihilation. The transformation was absolute and brutal. I ordered the War Production Board. The manufacturing of civilian automobiles in the United States ceased entirely in February 1942. It was a moment unparalleled in history. An entire nation-ish economy pivoted on a dime. The blueprint demanded an output that seemed like science fiction at the time. While Germany was still handcrafting its Tiger tanks with artisanal precision, the Americans applied the genius of Henry Ford to the business of industrial-scale killing. In Ypsilanti, Michigan, the Willow Run bomber plant rose from the mud. It was a factory so vast it had its own weather patterns inside, a cathedral of mass production. At its peak, this single facility produced one B-24 Liberator heavy bomber every 63 minutes. Hitler's Luftwaffe, which had spent a decade building its strength, suddenly found itself facing a sky that was literally being filled with American aluminum. The strategy was to make the enemy's losses irrelevant. For every American plane shot down over the Ruhr Valley, 2 more were already crossing the Atlantic. For every Sherman tank destroyed by a superior German 88mm gun, Detroit was shipping 5 more. The war had been turned into a game of numbers that the Reich could never win. This industrial leviathan was fueled by a radical social revolution. As millions of men were funneled into the military according to the secret mobilization quotas, the factories faced a labor crisis. The solution was the mobilization of a hidden army. The American woman, the archetype of Rosie the Riveter, was not just a propaganda tool. She was a logistical necessity. Millions of women entered the workforce, mastering complex machinery and high-precision welding. This was a demographic shift that Hitler, with his restrictive ideology concerning women's roles in society, could never match. Germany refused to fully mobilize its women for factory work until it was far too late, fearing it would destroy the traditional family unit. America, guided by cold pragmatism, sacrificed tradition for the sake of industrial throughput. But the Leviathan wasn't just about quantity. It was about the science of logistics. The blueprint detailed the creation of the Liberty ship. These were not beautiful vessels. Te were ugly, boxy cargo ships, designed to be built fast and in massive numbers. Early in the war, it took over 200 days to build a single ship. By 1943, thanks to modular construction techniques, They were being launched in less than a week. One ship, the SS Robert E. Peary, was famously assembled in just 4 days and 15 hours. German U-boat commanders were reporting a terrifying phenomenon. They were sinking ships faster than ever before, yet the Allied merchant fleet was actually growing. The industrial output of the United States had defeated the submarine as a strategic weapon. This era also saw the birth of a technological shadow that would eventually eclipse the world. Billions of dollars were funneled into research and development, leading to the creation of assets the Nazis could not match, while Hitler wasted resources on vengeance weapons. Like the V-2 rocket, which were terrifying but strategically ineffective, the Americans focused on the mundane but deadly mass-produced radar, proximity fuses for artillery, and high-octane aviation fuel. The HCA archive contains secret memos discussing the standardization of parts. An American mechanic in the middle of a Pacific jungle could take a part from a broken Jeep and fit it into a generator, because the blueprint mandated that every screw and bolt in the American military must be interchangeable. The German army, by contrast, was a nightmare of non-standardized equipment that required specialized mechanics and unique parts for every different model of tank and truck. The scale of this effort was reflected in the Big Inch and Little Big Inch pipelines, massive oil arteries laid across the American continent to ensure that the fuel for the European invasion would never run dry. The blueprint understood that oil was the lifeblood of modern war. While German tanks in Russia were being towed by horses because of fuel shortages, the American military was becoming the most motorized force in history. Every infantry division was backed by a fleet of thousands of trucks. This was material slacked. The War of Materials. As the smoke cleared from the chimneys of Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Gary, it became clear that the United States, had UNG joined the war, it had outmanufactured the very possibility of defeat. Hitler had built a regime based on the will of a single man. America had built a machine based on the collective output of 130 million people. The blueprint had predicted that 1943 would be the year the balance of power shifted forever. And the industrial fires had ensured that the prediction became an unavoidable reality. The past is watching. The blueprint was working, and for the Third Reich, the darkest hour was just beginning. While the industrial Leviathan was crushing the Reich under a mountain of steel, another war was being fought in absolute silence. It was a war of whispers, mathematics, and shadows. The blueprint had established the how of the war. How many tanks? How many men? But the intelligence war would determine the where and the when. The archives reveal that the American strategy contained a hidden Tocquincy's layer, a psychological and cryptographic assault designed to turn Hitler's own perceived genius against him. To win, America didn't just need to outproduce the Führer. They had to make him go blind. At the heart of this silent conflict was ultra. The Americans and the British had achieved the unthinkable. They had broken the enigma, the unbreakable German coding machine. This meant that the men in Washington were often reading Hitler's orders before his own generals in the field did. But the blueprint required something more dangerous than just knowing the enemy. Moves it required active deception on a global scale. The most famous manifestation of this was a masterclass in illusion known as Operation Fortitude. The HCA archive reveals the creation of a ghost world. To protect the secret of the die landings, the strategists mandated the creation of the first United States Army Group FUSE. It was a massive army that simply did not exist. Led by General George S. Patton, the man Hitler feared most, this ghost army was stationed in Kent, directly across from the Pas-de-Calais. The Americans built thousands of inflatable tanks, wooden planners, and fake radio stations. They even used sound trucks to play the noise of tank engines and shouting soldiers at night. Hitler's intelligence officers, looking down from their scout planes, saw exactly what the American blueprint wanted them to see. A massive invasion force poised to strike the wrong place. But the intelligence war went deeper than rubber tanks. It was about the cold science of information. The Americans mastered the art of strategic bombing intelligence. Using thousands of high-altitude reconnaissance photos, analysts in Washington identified the critical bottlenecks of the German economy. They didn't just bomb cities. They surgically targeted ball-bearing factories and synthetic oil plants. They realized that if you destroy the factory that makes the ball bearings for every German tank, You stopped the entire army without firing a single bullet on the front line. This was the surgical precision hidden within the massive industrial tide. The archives also revealed the dark work of the OSSCA Office of Strategic Services, the predecessor to the CIA. These shadow warriors were dropped behind enemy lines to arm resistance groups and sabotage German infrastructure from within. They were the architects of chaos, while the German Gestapo was looking for spies in the traditional sense. The OSS was focused on economic and logistical sabotage, ensuring that every train carrying Nazi supplies mysteriously derailed or lost its vital cargo. The blueprint had predicted that a distracted, paranoid Reich would bleed itself dry, trying to secure its own backyard. One of the most chilling documents in this section of the archive is the X2 file. It details how the Americans and British turned every single German spy in the United Kingdom into a double agent. Through the double-cross system, the Allies fed the German High Command a constant diet of carefully crafted lies. For years, Hitler believed his spies were telling him the truth, but every word they sent back was written by Allied intelligence officers. The American blueprint had successfully hacked the very brain of the Nazi state. By 1944, Hitler was a man living in a hall of mirrors, fighting enemies that weren't there and ignoring the dagger held at his throat. As the intelligence web tightened, the stage was set for the final reckoning. The factories had built the weapons, the planners had crunched the numbers, and the spies had blinded the enemy. The blueprint was about to move from the shadows into the light of history. The final chapter of the blueprint began on June 6, 1944. D-Day was not just a battle. It was the physical manifestation of every page we have explored in the HCA archive. The shadow over Washington, the cold math of the victory plan, the industrial fury of Detroit, and the deceptions of the intelligence war all converged on the beaches of Normandy. It was the reckoning. When the ramps of the Higgins boats dropped into the cold Atlantic surf, Hitler's empire was already dead. It just hadn't stopped breathing yet. The blueprint had ensured that the Allied force was so overwhelming that even a series of tactical mistakes or bad weather could not stop the momentum. For every German machine gun nest, there were 1,000 American shells. For every brave German soldier, there was an endless supply of American armor and fuel. The material schlecht. The war of materials had reached its absolute peak. The archives showed the steamroller effect in action. Once the breach was made, the American logistical machine took over with a speed that shocked the German High Command. They didn't just land men, they landed entire cities. They built Mulberry artificial harbors in a matter of days. They laid a secret fuel pipeline across the floor of the English Channel. They moved thousands of tons of supplies every single day to keep the front line moving at a pace Hitler's exhausted forces could not comprehend. His generals were used to a war of maneuvers and brilliance. What they faced now was a war of inevitability. As the Americans pushed toward the Rhine, the blueprint's most terrifying creation was unveiled in the background. The Manhattan Project. While the conventional war was reaching its climax, the Americans had spent billions to build a weapon that could end civilization itself. This was the ultimate insurance policy, hidden in the deepest layers of the archive. If the invasion had failed, the blueprint was prepared to use atomic fire to erase the Third Reich from the existence. Fortunately for the world, the industrial and conventional might of the victory plan proved sufficient on its own. By April 1945, the industrial Leviathan was parked in the ruins of Berlin. The men who had sat in those smoke-filled rooms in Washington in 1941 had seen their math become reality. They had turned a peaceful, isolationist nation into the most terrifying military force in the history of the world. They had proven that in the modern age, victory is not won by the sword alone, but by the assembly line, the slide rule, and the long-term vision of strategists. The final entry in the HCA archive on this subject is a simple, sober report on the unconditional surrender of Germany. There is no celebration in the text, only a cold acknowledgement that the objective had been met. The blueprint had worked. The United States emerged from the smoke of World War II not just as a victor, but as the world's only superpower. The shadow over Washington now stretched across the entire globe, defining the geopolitical landscape for decades to come. But at what cost? The archives remind us that this victory was paid for with the lives of over 400,000 Americans and millions of allies. And civilians, it was a victory built on a grand deception, a total mobilization of every human soul, and a cold, mathematical willingness to trade blood for steel. As the vault doors of HCA Archive close on this chapter, we are left with a final truth. History doesn't just happen. It is designed. The secret blueprint that defeated Hitler is a reminder that the world we live in today was forged in the silence of 1941. We are the children of that plan. The past is watching, and the archive never forgets.